Well, thank you, everybody. It's good to be here, and I'm hoping that this is a treat for you because it takes the pressure off me that no matter what I say, this is better than what you're normally used to. But then again, I see this is not a typical environment of school, so I don't know if that's the case here. I will say, just to sort of plug what you guys are doing here, because some of you, if you've been here since you've been young, you wouldn't know this because you don't know anything else, but it really is the case. I mean, if Mark, I told him, I said, if you had described to me the way this school works over a conversation, outside, I was you're making that up. I don't believe you. That's impossible. And then coming here and I see that it's true, unless you're all just actors and he bust you in here to fool me. I don't know. He's gonna have me go on fundraising for the school. I was like, yeah, you wouldn't believe it. These kids. So I don't know. We'll see if this really is just a big conspiracy you guys are putting on for me here. So I suppose I'm looking forward to the headmaster tea afterward to meet some of you. Not least of which is because I think probably in 20 years you guys will be running the world, and so it'll be good at that point if I'm friends with some of you. So that's part of my incentive for being here. Well, what I'm supposed to talk to you about is thinking like an economist, and I'm going to try to keep my sort of formal remarks short and then open it up to your questions. And obviously, as I'm going through this, if I'm losing you, raise your hand and I'll make sure I'm clarifying what I'm talking about. So I want to break it up into two sections. The first part is just to talk about what economists do in terms of what's called price theory. And not to get too complex, but basically one of the main things economists do, what their function is they're supposed to explain how market prices are formed. Like why is the price of a car what it is versus the price of an orange, things like that. And just I think the way to understand that evolution, because for example, in something like physics, I think those of you who, I don't know how much you've studied of it, but you understand what progress in physics looks like. That Isaac Newton, he had a great insight that he realized you can explain the motion of an apple falling from a tree using the same laws as describe the motion of the moon around the earth. And that's pretty amazing revelation until someone comes along and thinks of it, and then to us it seems like common sense. But as you know, there were flaws in the Newtonian system, and then Albert Einstein comes along and he gives equations that predicted things more accurately. Right, so that's what in physics progress looks like. In economics though, I would argue, and I'm part of a school that thinks like this, we would say that's not the goal in economics. The goal is not to come up with mathematical models that are going to predict what's GDP going to be next year. That's not what economists should be trying to do. Rather, what economists do is try to explain how a market economy functions, understand the principles of it. And there's lots of reasons for that distinction, and those of you who were looking at my book, I get into it more deeply there. But for our purposes here, let me just talk about this issue of what does progress look like in economics. And the way I'll do it is just talking about the evolution in terms of how economists think about the formation of market prices. So originally, the so-called classical economists, and these were people like Adam Smith and David Hume, some of those names you might be familiar with, they had an objective approach. They thought that market prices were based on the theory they would use would be the cost theory of value. Right? So they thought that they were trying to explain, just to give you an example, if a stagecoach in the market sold for 1,000 times what an apple sold for, and they're trying to explain, well, why is that the case? They would say, well, it's because there's a lot more labor that's involved in making a stagecoach than in growing a single apple. Okay, so that's the way they would think of that. They're trying to explain, well, there's more inputs going into the stagecoach, and so objectively it makes sense that should cost more, that its price should be higher. And that's the way they would reason. And ultimately they had, like I say, what's called a cost theory of value, or then they would push it back to a labor theory of value. So ultimately they said, the reason this thing would cost 1,000 times as much as that thing over there is this thing had 1,000 times more labor hours going into its production. And so that's the way they were reasoning. And that sort of made sense, right? That it seemed logical on the surface of it, that if something took a lot more labor to make, well, they would have to charge more for it to make it worth their while and so forth. But if you think about it, that's not really a fully satisfactory explanation, because let's say you're making a product that takes you 10 hours to make and you're charging a certain price for it. Well, why couldn't you just, if the labor theory of value is true and what determines how much you can charge for it is how much labor time goes into it, well then why don't you just work half as quickly? right? And you could just slow down and then take twice as long to make the thing and then charge twice as much because it took twice as much labor. But obviously, you couldn't do that, right? You can't just, I mean, especially you guys in this school probably can't get away with doing something like that, right? So in the real world, too, when you're out in the business world, you can't just say to your customers, no, we're going to double prices because we're going to work half as hard now. Obviously, people wouldn't go for that, right? At least not in the private sector. You might if you were teaching at a state school. So you see the problem there. So even though the labor theory of value to explain prices had a superficial plausibility, if you push it, it can't be the full story. All right, so I'm not going to give you the full explanation, but the modern theory starts with the insight that no, it's value, at least economic value, when you're trying to explain market prices, it's not something objective that's in the thing, it's in your mind, right? And the reason ultimately that people pay 1,000 times more for a stagecoach than for an apple is that they subjectively attach more importance to that stagecoach. That the uses people can get out of it are far more important than the use they can get out of an apple, and that's why they'd be willing to give up so much more money for the stagecoach. And it's true that if people are using their labor effectively, it's gonna be the case in equilibrium, as economists say, that things that take a lot of labor power to produce or a lot of labor hours are gonna end up having a higher price. But it's not that the labor causes the price, right? It's just that you wouldn't waste your time making something that took a lot of labor time unless it was going to be something that you thought other people would value and pay you a lot for. Okay, so it wasn't your hours per se causing the thing to be valuable. It was just you wouldn't be foolish and spend a lot of time making something that people weren't going to value on it for its own sake. All right, so that's just to give you one idea of how economists and their explanation of market prices evolved over time. So again, there was the classical economists like Adam Smith who made a lot of contributions, but his theory of market pricing was ultimately flawed. He just went down the wrong track trying to explain things objectively by looking at, well, how many labor hours are in it, when that was just not a very fruitful approach. Right? So you can see there, it's not that nowadays economists can predict and say, oh, not a stagecoach, you'd say an automobile or something, that we can predict what's going to be tomorrow better than Adam Smith could have predicted back in his day. That's not really the distinction. The distinction is that now our theory makes more sense. It's more internally coherent. Okay, so that's just one type of thing that economists do. Now, another avenue, do you have a question?
Maybe this is already obvious to everybody, but I'm wondering, why is there so much importance put on price, on what causes price? Why is it so important to know what really makes prices what they are?
That's such a deep question, I don't know. I guess the trivial answer would be that if anybody's going to be explaining market prices, it would be economists, right? That's part of what they do. So it's not that economics is not really about the study of money, which is what a lot of people think, but it is about the study of a market economy, and one of the main things that happens is people coming together in a market and bidding and causing prices. Now, maybe to follow up on that, prices are very important because, in a sense, they're like a communication mechanism. And so that's partly how we solve what's called the economic problem. That's how, if you just think about it, there's a certain limited resources that we have. People have all different competing uses for them. And how do we know if we're going to create this many cars or this many diapers or this many houses and so forth? And the way a market economy solves that is through the pricing system. And so that's part of the answer, that economists need to know what forms prices, because that's the way we communicate with each other in the economic arena. So I guess that would be the answer I would give for that. So you've got that to one side. Now, another thing that economists do a lot, and this is more fun, I would say, and it's what economists in their role as advisors or educators to the public do, is they typically think up of unintended consequences of certain government policies. And this is why the economists often would get a bad rap historically, that they were generally the cynics that were sitting in the corner saying, well, that's not going to work, right? And that's also why, if you've met a lot of economists, you would know it attracts a certain personality type, right? People that are real cynical and basically think they're smarter than everyone else, right? So some of you may be budding economists. So let me just give you a few examples of that. And again, the central theme here is that economists study how people respond to incentives. And that's not all that they do, but that's a pretty good snapshot or a good principle to understand what is it that economists do compared to biologists or physicists or what have you, is that economists really study the effect that incentives have on people, and so they can understand, they're pretty good at seeing, because they've seen so many examples of it, of knowing that, oh yeah, this new rule or policy that's put into place, they had these intentions for it, but you know what, in practice, X, Y, Z is going to happen because the policymakers weren't thinking it through carefully. So just to give you some examples, one that's pretty counterintuitive to a lot of people when they first hear it is seatbelt laws. And I don't know if I discussed this in the textbook, so even those of you who are good students and read the whole thing cover to cover, I don't know if I discussed this one, so this is, will justify you coming to hear the talk. So many states, they passed seatbelt laws, and there was a period where some states had them and some states didn't, so it provided a good test. So economists, well, let me just back up. So of course, the rationale, why would you pass a seatbelt law saying if a police officer sees you driving around without your seatbelt, you get pulled over and get a ticket? Well, obviously the rationale was public safety, right? That if you're too dumb to put on your seatbelt, well then the government's going to force you to do it, right? So it was very paternalistic, and there were some civil libertarians that objected just on principled grounds, saying who is the government to tell me what to do? If I want to drive around without a seatbelt, I should be able to do that. But most people, either fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your viewpoint, would say, oh yeah, but that's a very silly thing to put your foot down over, that if you don't want to protect yourself, then the government's going to force you to do it. That's in our interest as the state to go ahead and make you do that. But many economists brought up the fact that, okay, put that issue of rights to one side, important as it is, and just look at the pragmatic consequences. It's not clear that what you're doing is actually going to benefit the public health the way you think, right? Because the rationale assumes that people drive the same, whether or not they're being forced to wear seatbelts. And so if you have the same number of accidents and more people are wearing seatbelts because they're afraid of getting a ticket, well, you're going to have fewer fatalities. But what happened, the economist said, maybe that's not going to happen. Maybe people will drive more recklessly after you pass this law because now they're a little bit safer. Now, to a lot of regular people, they hear that and they say, come on, that's crazy. People don't get into a car and say, I think I'm going to get in an accident today, right? And that's true. They don't think that, but now, do you guys drive? Yeah. Okay, all right. Or I should say, do you drive legally? Okay, so as you know, it really isn't, and maybe you have to get older and get a little bit more reckless or lackadaisical, but you actually do. It's not the case that you're always focused and driving the most intently that's humanly possible. It depends on the circumstances. So, for example, I've noticed this in myself. If I'm driving and I'm by myself and you're coming up here and someone's pulling out this way, like they're going to turn right into the lane that you're going, and you know how they don't come to a full stop, they kind of slowly come out, and you think they're going to stop, but you're not sure. If I have a passenger, I will slow down in case that person goes so that there won't be a collision, whereas if I don't have a passenger, and especially if I'm late for something, I'll just go thinking, well, if he hits me, he's paying for it, right? Because it's not that he's speeding out 80 miles an hour. It's, I know no one's gonna, I'm not gonna break an arm or something, and it's, it's not like he has an infant strapped to the hood. So, can I make infant jokes? Okay. So you see the logic there. So even there, normally you would think, so in a sense, I'm making it more likely there's gonna be an accident by blowing through, or not blowing through, but by not stopping. I mean, I have the right of way. He should stop, but I'm going to assume it. Whereas if I have a passenger, I don't care who has the right of way. I'm going to slow down until I'm sure, okay, that guy's going to stop. Another example that most of you, the older people, would be sympathetic to is the safest I have ever driven in my life was the day that I drove my newborn son home from the hospital. I was like this. I was signaling. I was doing this. And I was driving like there was nitroglycerin in the trunk because you're very paranoid. You get the most precious thing in the world, and so believe me, you drive differently. Whereas if you're on, an interstate highway by yourself, you're fiddling with the radio, you're doing all kinds of stuff, and you're not as attentive there as you could be. All right. Whereas if it's raining and there's a bunch of tractor trailers passing you and so forth, you're probably not changing the CD. You're looking like this. Okay. So my point is, if you stop and think about it, you actually don't always drive as safely as humanly possible. It depends on the situation. And so if you're the type of person that without the government law would not put your seatbelt on, the argument was, well, if now you're forced to do it, you might feel a little bit safer, even if subconsciously you might drive a little bit more recklessly. And maybe not any individual person it wouldn't make a difference, but in the aggregate with thousands of people driving day in and day out, you're going to get more accidents. And so they went and they had a good, almost like a perfect laboratory experiment, because some states implemented the laws, and then you had adjacent states that one would implement it and the other one still wouldn't, and then they could look and see what were the relative fatalities and so forth before the new law went into place, and then look at it afterward, and you could really see the difference. And so what they found empirically was that when they put the new seatbelt law into place, there were more accidents, but there were fewer fatalities per accident, which is what you would expect, right? So people were hitting each other more because they were driving a little bit more recklessly, but since more of them were wearing seatbelts, fewer people died in the car accidents, all right? So there, it almost was a wash, but the one thing where it was an unambiguous loss was pedestrians and bicyclists. They were getting killed more because people were driving more recklessly, and the fact that the driver has a seatbelt on doesn't help the guy crossing the street, right? So anyway, just things like that is the sorts of things that economists point out, whereas without that insight and thinking through the logic of it, most people would think it was purely a matter of more public safety as against the freedom to live recklessly, when you could see, well, that's not necessarily true. Give you another example, laws to protect endangered species. Okay, so there, people, again, you had the debate, so the government would come in and say, oh, if there's a spotted owl or whatever it is on your land, some cricket or something that is endangered, then you got to stop your development and so forth, and the federal law protects them. And so obviously that caused controversy. You had environmentalists and animal rights groups on the one hand saying this, we need to do this for the good of the planet or whatever. And on the other hand, you had people worried about logging or saying, hey, this is my property, I can do what I want. And that was, so again, it was a matter of protecting the animals versus principles of private property. But then many economists, they started looking at these cases and they realized there was something else going on. That it's not clear, at least in every case, that these laws actually do what they're supposed to do. And there was this phenomenon called the 3 S's. So it was shoot, shovel, and shut up, which was that, I'm just quoting it, I don't want to use vulgarity. And so what would happen is, you just think about, you own a huge piece of property out in the west somewhere, and you're gonna put in a shopping center, let's say, right? And so you have the backhoes come in and they're digging it out and everything, and then you see some endangered owl that's on a tree. Well, you're not gonna call up the EPA and say, hey, come on out here, let me show you something. You're gonna shoot the thing, bury it, and then not tell anyone that you did that, right? Because if anyone sees that thing on your property, all of a sudden you can't develop it and you're out millions of dollars. Okay, so paradoxically, the rule in many cases gave landowners the incentive that if they found a nest of endangered owls or whatever on their property, they would destroy the things and hope nobody found out about it. Whereas, it's possible if they had developed it, then the owl could have lived next to the shopping mall, and people could have given it, salty pretzels or whatever on the way out. All right, so this is another example where it's not clear that the law was even doing what it was supposed to. All right, so those are just 2 examples. Let me give you one more, and I'll turn over to your questions. The issue of rent control. So rent control, it's a bigger deal in more urban areas, but the idea there is the government comes in and they say, uh-oh, apartment rents are going to be way too high if we just leave it to the forces of the free market. And so to help poor people, we'll pass a law saying that landlords for certain types of apartments in certain neighborhoods can't charge more than a certain amount. So they'll fix a legal ceiling on what the landlord can charge. So of course, that's very popular politically, because people think, oh yeah, why should these poor people, struggling young mothers, working and they're taking care of a bunch of kids, and they shouldn't be gouged and have to pay outrageous rents to the landlord who's some rich guy. So that's the mentality. So they think they're doing a favor to the poor renter by putting these laws into place. But of course, there's all sorts of unintended consequences when you do that. So just to give you a few of them, one thing right off the bat that happens is there's a shortage of apartments, right? Because the market price, and this is spelled out more in the textbook for those of you who read the chapter, the market price is the one that equates what's called the quantity supplied with the quantity demanded, meaning the amount of apartment units that the owners want to rent compared to how many apartment units do people want to go in and rent and live in, right? So if those numbers are different, the market's not in equilibrium, and typically what would happen is the market price would adjust. So if landlords are trying to rent out more units than people want to live in, and there's unrented apartments that are vacant, well, typically the landlord would have to lower the price until he convinced someone to move in. On the other hand, if the landlord had 5 people applying for every opening, every vacancy, he would say, well, gee, I'm not charging enough. I need to raise my price. Okay, so the market price, or what's called the market clearing price, that would happen if the government didn't tinker with it, is the one that balances those two forces. So say what you will about that price. Maybe you think it's too high, but say what you will, the market price is the one that allocates the scarce number of available apartment units to the people who want to live in them. So if the government comes in and says, no, it's illegal to charge that price, you have to charge a lower price, well then necessarily that means more people want to live in apartments than the landlords want to rent out. And so there are people who can't get an apartment. And so what do? Well, they have to double up, live with their parents, or they have to just, it's a real hassle to get an apartment. So with you guys, I don't know how true this is going to ring, because I don't know in your personal experience if you've encountered this, but certainly when I lived in grad school, I lived in New York City, and it was a real hassle if you had to move. Like you had to, get on lists, you had to go meet with a broker, you had to pay all sorts of fees to brokers to find you an apartment. And so it wasn't, in contrast, if you wanted to go buy a plasma screen TV and you had the money, you would just go down to Best Buy or whatever and you could have it that day. Whereas if you wanted to rent an apartment, it wasn't a matter of being willing to pay the money. It could take you months to find it, particularly if you wanted to live in a certain neighborhood. All right, so that's one problem right off the bat, is that it causes immediate shortage, meaning that there's not enough apartment units to go around to satisfy the demand. Just give you a couple more implications or consequences of rent control. You have the problem that now you have to know somebody in order to get an apartment, right? Because what happens is the people who are in the apartments, they know they're a coveted thing, right? And so if you're living in some great location in Manhattan, for example, where the apartment really ought to be $1,000 a month, but legally it's only $700 a month, well, then you know that's a really good deal. And so the person who's living there now, if they have to move out, they're not just going to leave, they're going to ask around their friends and acquaintances and say, hey, does anyone want to take this place over? Because they're doing that person a favor. So I knew that I had a friend who got a great place, and it was in a really cool area of town, and his rent was ridiculously low for that area in terms of what it should have been in a free market. And how did he get that? Well, it's because his cousin used to live there, and his cousin was getting married, right? And it wasn't the kind of place where you could have a wife, but believe me, the place was disgusting. And so the guy couldn't keep living there, but he didn't, again, just want to give it up to the landlord and let the landlord pick some lucky person he wanted to do a favor for, so he asked around, and then my friend, who was his cousin, went into it. But legally, they don't like that. They frown upon that, so they had this ridiculous thing where the cousin would still have his mail sent there because he didn't want the postal worker to realize somebody else was living there. And so he kept his mail there. My friend would get that guy's mail and give it to him every few days. My friend had his mail sent to me, and I would give it to him because he couldn't have his mail sent to where he lived, right? Because then again, the postal worker would think something was funny. All right, so you see all these things to get around, the government regulations. And the other thing, as I alluded to, just one other consequence of rent control, is that the apartments become disgusting, right? Because think about it, if you're the owner, you're the landlord, and originally you were able to rent these things out for $1,000 each, and that would be the price that would balance the people who wanted to live there versus how many units you had available. Well, you would be interested in customer service, just like any other business person would, right? So if the hot water goes out at 2 o'clock in the morning, and your angry customers call you, some guy was for some reason taking a shower at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he calls you up, you would maybe go out there and fix it right away, or you'd be out there first thing in the morning because you want to keep your customers happy, because if you're giving them bad service, they're going to move somewhere else because they're paying you the market price. They could go pay that somewhere else. Whereas under rent control, that's not the case. You don't care. If somebody threatens to move out, you say, go ahead. There's a line of people who want to get in here. So I don't care. Go ahead. I'm not going to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and answer the phone. Right? And so you could see that these rent-controlled apartments, just over time they would deteriorate, that the landlord had no incentive to put up fresh coats of paint. Safety things like if it's a sort of bad area of town, normally you'd want to have really bright lights, and in the stairwell, have those mirrors that are up in the corner so you can see if someone's about to whack you with a crowbar, that kind of stuff. But they didn't have that kind of stuff, because why would he spend the money to put the mirror up? It's not like he's going to rent out more apartments or he can charge more money. So that would just be money he'd be throwing away, right? So that's what would happen. And then you also had this phenomenon where a real tender-hearted person who would feel bad about maintaining such a dilapidated apartment where people are getting mugged in the stairwells and so forth because he doesn't hire a guard or he doesn't put in the proper lighting, that person's just going to leave the industry. He doesn't want to be in that business anymore, and he can't charge enough to do it the way he wants to. So the people who end up owning these apartments are not particularly the nicest people in the world, right? And they have a term for them. They're called slumlords, right? And so they're real vicious people who are very cruel, and they don't care about the tenants, and if somebody's giving them a hard time, they just kick them out and bring somebody else in, right? So my point is this notion of there being slumlords. A lot of people think, oh yeah, that's the market economy for you, that's capitalism. Well, no, that's what happens when the government intervenes and puts in place rent control laws. That it makes it so that only the person who is a slumlord can run that business and turn a profit, that anybody else would go out of business, because if they were, they just would feel bad about, well, no, gee, I have to hire a guard to stay in here. Well, they wouldn't be able to make enough money then to stay in business. All right, why don't I stop there and turn it over to your guys' questions? Yes, sir.
It seems that many of these laws of economy are very basic. However, the government seems to be putting them in anyway. And I mean, I read part of your book for the assignment for T this week, and I thought it made a whole lot of sense. But why don't the people who are running the country know this data, and why are they putting in laws like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The version I usually get, people say, Bob, are these people in Washington, are they stupid or evil? And I just say, well, they're not stupid. And I pause. So the problem is and I'm going to speak in broad brushstrokes, obviously, but I think the general answer is they're putting those policies in place for reasons other than the official justification. So, for example, minimum wage laws, which I didn't get to, I want to leave time for your question, but minimum wage laws are another common example. And there, it's not just free market economists. The general economists agree that, okay, yeah, there's problems and that causes unemployment among unskilled workers. And so, but politicians will go up there and say, yeah, we want to have a living wage. We want to make it worthwhile for people to work, and that's why we're passing this. And so you could say, well, gee, don't they read Economics 101 textbooks? Why are they doing that? Well, it's because they're getting contributions from labor unions. And so if you're a highly skilled worker in a labor union, you're effectively outlawing the competition. So if the government, so I'll just give you an example. If I am a skilled worker and I make $25 an hour, and there's this guy over here who's not nearly as skilled, but he's willing to work for $3 an hour, he can compete with me. But if the government passes a law saying you have to be paid $8 an hour, well, now he's out of a job and I get more business. So that's part of it, that a lot of these policies, they benefit certain groups even though they're detrimental to the average person. And so the politicians can get up there and come up with nice things. But what is true is, so people say, well, then isn't it hopeless? Well, no, because the politician can only get away with that because public opinion supports that. So if the general public understood the principles of economics, then they wouldn't fall for it. So that's why everyone should buy my book. Other question? Yep.
When he gave his question and you answered it through the minimum wage laws, what about the other stuff you were talking about, seatbelts and the apartments and other stuff? How does the government benefit from that?
Okay, that's a good question. I mean, here I'm speculating with the seatbelt stuff. I've talked with people that, well, actually it wasn't with the seatbelt, it was with airbags. Okay, so Airbag Regulation, similar type of story. I don't get into it in this textbook. In another book I wrote, I fleshed out the story. But just to give you the details, you guys probably know that there were cases where if you're like a 75-pound person and you get an airbag goes off, you could die, right? So like kids or like really dainty women, they could have problems. So federal legislation that forces cars to have airbags installed, a lot of people were saying, well, you shouldn't be able to do that. And so the compromise they came up with was not that you could be exempt from that and not get it installed, but that you could take it to your mechanic, and if you fit the requirements and the government signed off on it and you had like a letter from the government, the mechanic would turn it off, but it would still have to be installed. And so you say, well, why would they do that? Well, it's whatever it is, $1,500 to install it, to put the airbag in the car. And so, not that I have memos that I can point to, but my guess is the companies that install airbags were very much in favor of legislation saying every car in America has to have an airbag after this date. So that'd be one example. The seat belts, I don't know off the top of my head. Maybe the funeral directors, because now more bicyclists would be dead. I don't know. That's a joke. Okay. I don't know that one off the top, but I do know. I've seen it was willful ignorance that I knew a guy. I think it was in Washington State when the airbag stuff went through. He would collect the statistics because you could use federal data and look at the statistics and show. It's a little bit hard to get into up here, but it wasn't just frail women and kids who would die. It was also like above a certain speed, statistically, even if you were like a regular sized male, you could die from the airbag, right? That it was only like, or sorry, the other way around, that on low speed collisions, the airbag was actually more dangerous than not. And so, and you could see it using the data that the National Highway Safety Administration, or whatever that board is, kept. And so he would show it year after year. And then their solution was they stopped showing that breakdown in the data, like on their website. They just, like they stopped disaggregating and they just threw it all into a lump. So now that guy couldn't make the crisp comparison anymore, and so his case fell apart. So it was that sort of thing. So what's in it for them? I mean, I'm sure whoever did that, their boss told them to do it, and it could have just been like once the policy's in place, it would be very embarrassing. The government wouldn't want to come out and say, oh yeah, we've been killing people for the last 5 years. We'll change the policy. That they would rather just, brush it under the rug. But why did it go in place in the first place? I'm not sure for that one. Other question?
You mentioned that economists their job is partially to try and make predictions. What exactly does it take to be able to make pretty basic predictions about what's going to happen with laws?
Okay, well, let me clarify. Some economists, they think that's what they're supposed to be doing. I'm actually part of a school of thought that thinks economists shouldn't be aping the methods of the physicists, all right? So it's true, a lot of top-notch economists now, like if you go to MIT or Harvard, they do believe that, yep, our job is to make these models that predict GDP next year. I don't think that's very fruitful because their models are bad, right? That they don't do a good job of it. I mean, I don't know if you guys knew this, but the Obama administration, when they first came in and they were pushing the stimulus package, their economists were saying if we push this thing through, unemployment won't exceed 8%. And they said if we don't do it, then unemployment might get up to be 9%. And of course, unemployment with the stimulus was over 10%, right? And so now what did they say? Did they say, oh, we're wrong and we resign? No, they just say, whoa, the economy was worse than we realized. It's a good thing we passed that stimulus, right? So now, if you disagree with their view already, then it seems like they're charlatans. But of course, if you agreed with them, then it would make sense, right? If it were a standard medical treatment like giving chemotherapy or something for somebody with cancer, that depending on if you thought that was the right treatment and they did it and the person got sicker, you might just say, well, the cancer was worse than we realized, right? So it doesn't, that anecdote I just told you doesn't prove they're wrong, but it does show that they're sort of inoculated from realizing they're wrong, that no matter what happens, they can always just say no. So I actually don't think economists should be in the business of trying to make those types of predictions. I think we can make general predictions. Like I can say with confidence, if we impose rent control laws, there's going to be shortages. But what I mean is I don't think it's fruitful to say, and there's going to be a downfall of 10.6% in housing availability or something like that. Some economists do that, but I think it's more important to just teach these general principles. Let me go back right there.
Like, how do economists work? Like, who hires you guys, or like, do you guys just volunteer to make contribute ideas?
Okay, yeah, so the question was, who hires economists? A lot of different groups, all right? So the Federal Reserve hires a bunch, the government hires a bunch. They're not too interested in my services. There's private think tanks. They hire a bunch. A lot of economists work for, they're college professors, and that's how they get their paycheck, is from working for a school, and then they write books and things on the side. So I'm a little bit unusual. I'm more of a freelance economist. Sometimes I say I'm a mercenary economist. And so I go around and give talks and write books and things, but it's varied to answer your question. But yeah, I think most of them either work for the government, either directly or indirectly by working for a state school or the Federal Reserve. Yes, sir, in the back.
Would you discuss the rising health care costs? Do you feel that was government-driven or insurance company-driven? Can you discuss that?
Sure. So the question was rising health care costs. Well, if the question is, why over the course of the 20th century has health care been constantly getting more expensive when things like computers get cheaper, yeah, I definitely think the government and the insurance companies have a lot to do with it, but the insurance companies only because of the framework the government set up. So just to give you a couple examples of what has happened, in World War II, the government put in place wage and price controls, right? Because the Federal Reserve was creating a bunch of new money, and that was a backdoor way to pay for the war, right? Because they were raising taxes, and they still had huge deficits because they were spending so much on bombs and so forth. And the public wasn't going to tolerate them raising all that through taxes. So instead, the Federal Reserve was creating new money. So normally that would just cause prices to go way up. So the government didn't want that to happen, and so they imposed wage and price controls, making it illegal for wages to rise above a certain percentage per year. So again, unintended consequences. What happened? Well, still, companies wanted to attract better workers. So now legally they weren't allowed to offer the person a raise. So instead they said, okay, well, if you come work for us, we'll pay for your health care. And so that was legal under the wage and price controls. So that was partly why we had, because if you think about it, it's a little bit weird. It's not like your employer pays for your car insurance, right? It's not like someone says, oh man, I can't drive anymore. Why? Because I lost my job and I don't have car insurance, right? Nobody talks like that, whereas everyone talks like, oh yeah, I lost my job. I don't know what I'm going to do about health insurance. So the link between having your health insurance paid for by the employer is partly because of that historical precedent, also just the tax laws. If my employer gives me $5,000 and I use that to go buy health insurance with it myself, I get taxed on that because that's part of my salary. Whereas if the employer takes that same $5,000 and pays an insurer and part of a group health plan, it's not taxed, right? It's not that on my personal taxes I have to put down, oh, when I have health insurance from my employer, the premium is such and such, so I'm getting taxed. That's not part of your salary. Okay, so that's another reason that the tax code makes it such that it makes a lot more sense. It's a win-win for the employer and employee if the employer separately pays for insurance. So what that does, though, is it separates the recipient of health care services from the person who pays for it. So now when people go into the doctor's office and the doctor says, oh yeah, you need this test, and this test, people don't normally ask, well, how much does that cost? Do I really need it? They just say, okay, because they know their insurance is going to either pay for it outright or pay 85% or whatever it is. And so people don't even think about it. They just think of health care as this sort of amorphous thing that, well, you need health care. Whereas any other service, if you go into the car mechanic and he says, well, you need this new thing that's going to cost you $800, you might say, do I really need that? And you say, well, no, you can get by a few months without it. Whereas people don't really talk like that when they're in the hospital. And part of it, again, is because they've been, the system has separated them from the payment. So, of course, in the grand scheme of things, somebody's paying for that. People are paying for it in the premiums to the health insurance company, but the point is the medical expenditures keep going up because nobody's watching the costs. So that would be my general answer as to why that's happened, is because healthcare is a very highly regulated sector where the people who are actually buying the services aren't taking into account the direct cost. Yeah. Okay.
My question is, you mentioned earlier about laws, government laws that for safety, such as airbags and seatbelts,
Yep.
And how that may affect the economy. how do you think the law in most states about texting and driving affects the economy, let's say, of cell phones?
Okay. In case you didn't hear that, he's saying the laws about texting and driving. I think that's relatively recent, so I don't think there's been actual studies done, like looking at what were the traffic accidents before and after. But I have heard anecdotal evidence, people suggesting one of the downsides of that is not before, if you were driving and texting, what would you do? You'd be like this. Now that they passed the law, it's not that people aren't texting, it's they're texting like this, right? So the cops can't see them do it. So it's not clear that, are you actually minimizing? So again, there's the trade-off. There are some people now that might not text at all because they don't want to get a ticket, but now there are some people who otherwise would have been like this that are now like this, and maybe they're more likely to get into an accident. So you got to see which effect counterbalance. With all this stuff, I should clarify, it's not that in every single case I can show you, the government intended to do this, and actually it's counterproductive, but the point is just a lot of times there's these offsetting things that people don't take into account. Yes, ma'am.
Economists seem to find problems with the laws and policies that are passed. Who poses solutions for them? Do you?
I can't recall any solution I've ever posed. No. Yeah, some economists do that. It's tricky because like I said, I'm a pretty free market kind of guy, and so I'm very cynical about with anything the government's going to do. I can usually say, well, if you do that, then this and this is going to happen. So it's true. I personally would not be one proposing too many solutions, except, well, you should get rid of this whole bureaucracy, that kind of thing. So that's the route I take, is I try to explain how a market would work and why it would be better. Now, it's true. I mean, you could do piecemeal reform. So I have, in the past, written a thing for California about a flat tax reform, for example, like taking their tax code, having one rate, and getting rid of deductions and things. But even there, I was very squeamish in doing it because certain people were going to end up paying higher taxes under my system than they currently do. And so I was actually recommending a tax increase on people, which is something that makes me sweat. So anyway, yes, economists do those sorts of things, and again, though, it's a tricky thing because once the government opens that Pandora's box and starts regulating, you're going to end up hurting somebody. And unless you're just totally rolling it back, if you believe in a sort of free market economy, if that's your goal, you're always going to be doing compromises. So it's a very tricky area, and that's one of the areas where people argue with each other over strategy is, should we be real purist and sort of not be in the conversation because people say, well, come on, you're not being serious. But once you want to be at the table crafting legislation, whatever comes out of it, you're not going to be happy with. So even there, it's a bit of a trade-off. We got one more? Yes?
How much government interference do you think would be ideal for our market today?
You guys familiar with the concept of zero? Yeah, that's. She wanted to know how much government interference do I think would be optimal. So yeah, I'm a pretty purist guy in that regard. Of course, I don't think realistically that's going to happen next week. But yeah, I mean, I do think that if more people were educated and saw that the benefits of a voluntary society and people providing things themselves, that would ideally be the outcome. Okay, thanks everybody.